there were some other important cultural aspects to the uh, cultural residue that makes up this uh, modern crisis, which is obviously also probably a reflection of uh, similar cultural doom spirals that have transpired and sort of litter the historical record. Obviously, we don't have uh, we have uh, more detailed records of some of them and less of others. But I mean, I've always had this model of how the Mayan civilization probably had a similar sort of slave morality and a kind of a weird kind of external authority, in terms of the human sacrifices at the end of its, sort of gasping breath as it sort of uh, deluded itself into a kind of ideological narrative uh, so that it could sort of overlook pragmatic, tangible. I mean, there were obviously elements in Mayan civilization which were very advanced and intelligently, the building of the temples and the obsession with the work done in terms of the great stone uh, architecture and things like that. The it was quite an elegant solution to the uh, Malthusian trap, that essentially you have a lot of energy being spent on essentially building uh, that kind of those sorts of elaborate stone structures, and then in times of a bad harvest or a sort of climactic as volatility and poor yields, then essentially you would stop spending human calories on building these grand works, and then essentially you would have tapped into a kind of reservoir of surplus, of excess, which was essentially being constantly invested into these building projects. So it was kind of like a self imposed uh, millstone around the neck of the Mayan civilization, dampening essentially the expansion of the population down to that sort of that Malthusian sort of trap. And so essentially the expansion of the population was curtailed by the large scale investment into those building projects. And so essentially in times of stress, in times of pressure on the food supply, you could just essentially stop building them and you would have access to essentially spare capacity in terms of anyway. But when those kinds of intelligent sort of pro-social structures that the society has been baked into and inculcated into the structure of their society, when that simply becomes a kind of an ideological narrative, which is supplying this external authority and external locus of control, then you can kind of get sort of incepted into that mythology, and you can't see the wood for the trees, and you don't even understand the levels of operational functionality that is built within the design of your civilization, and then you essentially uh, you're sort of driving a kind of decadent, excessive um, self-delusional sort of aspect. Anyway, what I wanted to revisit in the cultural understanding of the crisis that we're dealing with, and how I've already kind of ontologically centered it around feminism and essentially a section of the female population which has these this exploitation of certain cultural conventions and how addicted they are to those cultural conventions, but also the deep level of hypocrisy that is built into that kind of exploitation, because not only do they indulge in that kind of exploitation, but then they also complain about the other facets of the fact that they have access to this special um, exploitative cultural function that they have etched out for themselves, that they've carved out for themselves, in which they jealously protect. And another way of describing uh, the strange kind of infantilism which is relied on by women that buy into this kind of this special identity, which it always has that weird sort of double standard that, like, somehow feminism is saying that women are just as equal as men, but then they're also still morally pure and virtuous and innocent, and some, they're separate, but they're equal, but they're better as well. It's sort of weird sort of delusional thinking like that. But another way of describing it essentially is, and again, like, you can understand why some of these relations evolved, because essentially it does something to secure the status of women within culture and society, and therefore it offers them extra protection. And to the extent to which that men are more dispensable um, and expendable to the kind of pro-social benefit that, just like, essentially a society that has more healthy females is going to do better than another society that doesn't concentrate the burdens and exploitation onto men, and sort of protect their female population. Essentially, having a healthier female population means in general that people will be healthier, because they are the biological capital that society essentially is powered by. And so, to the extent to which a culture and a society entrenches the interests of women and secures them to some degree, it will promote a kind of pro-social advantage as well, a competitive advantage between groups that don't do this. And essentially, this is also how our species, humans, outcompeted the other humanoid species on the planet, is that we had specialization of labor that was uh, our species. I mean, the Neanderthals were, or at least it is understood that they were much more egalitarian, that their women hunted with their men. But that was not the case in our species. So our species has a kind of specialization of labor that is centered around um, uh, biological sex, and therefore obviously cultural gender roles emanating from that, and sexual mores and such constellating around that basic division, as it were. Now, obviously, this sophisticated or complexity can lead essentially to a more nuanced, a better synthesis. It can lead to a greater integrated whole if it is managed by, let's say, an enlightened culture, by a culture that is capable of dealing with these complexities, rather than trying to kind of oversimplify them and try to leverage identities and generalizations and kind of cherry picked, kind of narrative imposition that I have characterized this kind of this pathology of a kind of ideological narrative and such, which I've related to borderline personality disorder. But I mean, what you can see in the perniciousness of borderline personality disorder, which very readily takes on board cultural conventions and adopts them and uses them to push people's buttons and to incept people into the leveraging of the narrative, in often very specious aspects. But anyway, what I was just going to say is that, these stereotypes or that narrative can be transcended without it being essentially dissolved. It doesn't have to be essentially destroyed. It can be used as a point of departure. It can be used as as a conventional meeting ground, as a sort of as a space, just to it can be used as a sort of as a game that no one is playing, believing that they are the roles that the game pieces that they have been given. Essentially, it's just it's a point of departure. It's a point of first contact. It's sort of like, in the same way that gender is used in order to assume someone's pronouns. That it just gives you a level of a conventional set of instruments that makes communication, that makes introduction. It basically gives you a fast track into uh, into sharing certain and obviously individuals can opt out of that, but the idea that they're going to opt out of that and then sort of be just as catered to by a culture it's an impossibility. You can't have, I mean, that's what culture is. Culture is a shared vocabulary. It's a, and to the extent that you're going to essentially exhaust culture by essentially injecting a kind of pluralism into it is antithetical to the notion of culture itself. The idea that you're going to create a cultural shorthand that everyone just must be programmed by some kind of orthodox, sort of Pulit bureau, um, is that you're going to sort of regiment new social constructs and indoctrinate people into into an advanced state of being. Is to corrosively essentially blame the liberal paradigm and the individual, sort of uh, uh, faculty of controlling and directing culture from the individual scale, and to sort of just and to essentially to blame the spirit of individualism as essentially the source of all evil. And in some sense, there's a version of that which is perhaps correct, but it's not correct in the collectivized sense. It's only correct in the individual sense, and you have to try to be convincing on the level of the individual in terms of exchanges and communications. But the idea to which that you're going to sort of get people to be conditioned and imprinted by a kind of uh, a generalized uh, narrative, in some sense, is to essentially create a mythologized sort of moral slavery or something like that. And it's not even going to be a real morality in some sense, where it's not going to have a genuine ethic built into it, because it's basically going to be, well, because of the narrative, you ought to do this. And famously, you cannot derive an ought from an is. And this is, so it's all centered on on a very toxic form of epistemic conduciveness, um, which is essentially what identity politics is all about. Just as how borderline are always leveraging these covert dilemmas, which they are pummeling their targeted hosts with, to have to process and to sort of circumvent the horns of that dilemma, as they sort of decompartmentalize their host until they can sort of set up the house of mirrors kind of juxtaposition, um, uh, very flagrantly sadistically edged, kind of reimagining of reality, using the other person's integrity as a kind of vehicle to offset any kind of uncomfortable issues of responsibility, essentially a kind of an emotional garbage receptacle to to absorb the toxin and the rage of the frustrated. Essentially, without deploying these dilemmas, there is no way for the borderline essentially to derive a sense of acquisition, a sense of. I mean, I've always thought that borderline, if it could be characterized as any of the deadly sins, it would essentially be greed. It's a kind of insatiable greed, um, which is often hidden beneath layers of, kind of the I can't remember what the technical psychological term is, but they're kind of their diffusion of identity into many valences of sort of many ensembles of potential sort of unilateral exhibition of their subjective feelings. So they've got many sort of versions of soapboxes and pulpits to sort of try to direct the action of their very choreographed drama, which they are trying to essentially rope their audience or their target host into reacting to and processing on behalf of their domineering stream of subjective feelings and consciousness, essentially, that they need someone that will essentially be their soundboard for this. So there's an implicit sort of almost, and it comes out even quite clearly when it's frustrated, a psychopathic overarching strategy of a kind of unilateral uh, subversion of the other person's boundaries, um, and the borderline success in being able to sort of psychologically penetrate the other person's sense of integrity becomes an ongoing theme that eventually allows them to deploy the house of mirrors, in which they have a kind of joint and separable kind of integrity that can be sort of even post hoc uh, um, used as the wedge to kind of reorientate reality and situations and reframe and recontextualize um, any discomfort and displeasure, where they can abrogate to themselves a kind of purity of essence and of being and of rightness, and they can export all of the loose odds and ends of their drama onto a kind of scapegoat. Uh, anyway, the thing that I wanted to actually focus on though is to mention another aspect of this. So I mean, you can see this also as an element in the Roman law of uh, the legal minority status of women, that they were treated essentially as minors. Um, I this is I mean, this was inherited by Roman law in the West to a large extent, when women were treated as minors as well. But I mean, in the Roman situation, it's actually in some sense the status of woman, practically speaking, culturally speaking, was much higher um, than this legal arrangement, because there were actually very few people in there who were Roman citizens. Essentially, only the paterfamilias was and his heir were really Roman citizens, having full rights of citizenship. And there were very few paterfamiliases, basically. So Um, and there were also vast amounts of duties and obligations. Any paterfamilias could be a slave if they did not pay their debts, for instance. So anyway, it's a very sort of streamlined legal system. But anyway, so I'm just want to discuss essentially the origin of where this idea might come from in terms of the legal minority of women. And I think it generally centers around this identification within essentially female sexuality, within culture, that manifests as a kind of fetish towards sexual neoteny. And so neoteny essentially is when uh, or sexual neoteny at least denotes the process in which juvenile features in a species are related to sexual fitness, essentially. And so essentially the cult of youth in terms of woman, in terms of, and I mean, you can see this even in the language, and feminists ironically complain about this. They complain that women are treated like children, or or they're sexualized in a way in which they are also infantilized. But then they also cling to essentially the, I would say, the correlating sort of cultural face of the same aspect, which is that women inhabit a kind of a uh, a unique virtue, and possess a kind of you know it's I mean, it's weird because that they can kind of they can sort of make magical claims, essentially. It's weird because it's sort of, it has essentially, right at the outset of that kind of unique claim is this weird kind of uh, incoherent speciousness about how uh, women are just as equal to men at everything, but also better. It's that kind of very strange kind of and I mean, you can hear this quite annoyingly when women sort of try to defend that sentiment, just how childlike they sound, because they always have to basically, it's like you're hearing a 5-year-old having a temper tantrum, or like in terms of how they will just almost in a bold-faced way they will argue, and it just in a very embarrassing, nebulous, I mean, you can hear, there are examples of this all the time, uh, where you don't know what you're talking about, you don't know what you're talking about, just this strange sort of repetition of, no, you just don't talk about feminism, you don't know, you don't even understand what you're talking about, you have no idea what you're talking about. It's just this kind of this strange profuse denial. It will say something persuasive, but no, they can't, because they've only got a narrative, they've only got a kind of epistemic conduciveness, which essentially they can only indicate and signify by essentially table thumping and by using tautological, childish, sort of nonsense logic. And it's always, you can tell that it's always centered around this extracting an ought from an is. It's basically, it's antithetical to normative morality. They don't believe in normative reality, they believe in this weird kind of magical thinking. And women, as a cultural kind of construct, then have this power that they can just sort of engage in this magical thinking. And I mean, this has been the biggest problem. I mean, feminism has done some good things in its earlier incarnations, in sort of uh, looking at domestic violence and abuse of men. But I mean, I would also say that this was this is not special in this time. I think these things were always known about, and they were always looked down on to a large extent. They were always culturally frowned on. But uh, I'll just say that I think that where we've really let down society, and where also a lot of these abusive men come from, is that they are manufactured by female psychopaths, basically. That essentially, because the gaze, the moral gaze of society passes over women with presumption of innocence and purity, you know, we are, it's a sort of, it's a self-inflicted injury to the extent to which that there is this willful um, belief that women get a kind of a unique and special exemption to having their integrity developed or scrutinized, um, and those things become often elements of the same thing, because something that is not scrutinized will not be developed. So it's this cult of unaccountability. But there's this other important element here, to do with sorry, I'm just trying to collect my thoughts. But in the exploitation of the double standards, um, and there's sort of this idea that I guess also because the exploitation of this kind of sexual neoteny and its cultural fallout, which is this void in terms of, or this lacuna in terms of the integrity of woman, which then, that becomes kind of confused. If the sexual neoteny is not somewhat transcended, is not, but as I said, I've tried to explain that you can understand that almost from an evolutionary standpoint of culture, because females do have more biological value than men do in terms of their pro-social um, ability to promote the success of a society, because essentially a society that has healthier, protected women will essentially outperform other societies. I mean, all other things being equal, generally speaking. Um, Culturally, it's very hard if too many men die, but essentially, the as long as you can kind of concentrate all the expendability of people within a society to the male section of the population, your society is going to be better off, because it can absorb that, generally speaking. Um, but having developed this cultural edifice now, and women having the freedom to sort of to venture into further elaboration and exploitation using that kind of sexual neoteny, which is essentially that they have all the freedom of choice, uh, but then they can also essentially shirk adult responsibility using the kind of the sexual valence of essentially this um, minority, this idea that no, they're a minor when it comes to the consequences of their decisions, but they are also a major, or they have a legal right to exercising a legal status of majority when they are, sort of gambling against the hedge that they can revert back to being a minor, to being treated as a minor under the protection of a system that should have saved them essentially from whatever consequence might be displeasurable or uncomfortable. So it's this I mean, I guess this is another example of the Motte and Bailey sort of paradigm thing. But like, I mean, there are also other, let's say, reasons why this kind of these relations would develop, because essentially, I mean, Jordan Peterson has pointed this out, um, that obviously from an evolutionary perspective, it would make sense that women would develop proclivities essentially in order to test how safe their environment is in order to have children, because essentially, uh, and also from a kind of biological level, you can understand that women would have within themselves a kind of inclinations towards not just looking after their own interests, but essentially thinking in such a way as to be able to secure the interests of a young infant and the woman within an environmental context. And so, if they have to think on behalf of themselves and a young infant, there is a certain level of sort of societal fabric, or at least social norms, which you can understand why there would be a propensity for them to demand and sort of try to etch out a sense of entitlement that would be conducive to the well-being of mother and infant. Um, so I mean, and hypergamy as well can be deconstructed also, um, into some of those terms as well. Uh, I would say that borderline is not so conducive to the health of mother and infant, uh, but it does sort of approximate some of the same sorts of things. And also, I mean, there are, there are double-edged swords all over the place, because you have to understand that although the section of the female population that has sort of borderline proclivities and borderline personality um, behavior is going to sort of influence the young and the next generation, and sort of the extent to which that it has to be managed by culture is also an engine of sophistication. That essentially, the devastation that is caused to children and to the young and the development of the young is obviously profound, and it is an overlooked issue within the issue of the family, or at least the health of the family. But um, the extent to which it also creates an opportunity for some children to uh, overcome that form of abuse is also a kind of testing ground, is also a developmental path for greatness. Let's just say, overcoming adversity essentially. And I would say that there is little competition for what can be more adverse than the kind of insidious undermining and sort of psychological warfare, in a household uh, that is populated with sort of cluster B personality disordered people. You know, that kind of trauma and abuse uh, can be a very important source of character development, without which perhaps we would not have developed, the great minds that populate history, perhaps, that have brought us forward. Um, but anyway, that you're having to confront these dragons and these demons at a very young age, basically, uh, sort of overcoming them throughout the early developmental stages, being having to contend with them. Uh, I mean, many people do not cope with these things well, and they become twisted and disordered themselves. This is also how monsters um, get developed. This is where male psychopathy. I mean, I'm sure that one could easily make huge parallels between male narcissists and male psychopaths, and uh, the personality disorders that their mothers perpetrated essentially upon them. But just as many people sort of uh, succumb to their toxic environs, there are others which find a way to sort of to thrive. Um, so anyway, there's a lot of humanity is a mixed bag, as it were. Um, but I mean, it also, one wonders essentially if we just cut out the kind of the poison uh, on a cultural level, if we cleaned up the act on a cultural level, if we matured and developed a kind of a cultural consciousness, that would somewhat be the cradle for developing a more enlightened society and culture, and within 2 generations, you know, we could be in a much better position. We could be in a much healthier position. Um, and the kind of the cycles of these psychological politics, we could essentially identify them. Um, and I mean, I'm seeing very clear cycles between what's going on now culturally, and what happened essentially in Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Anyway, there was a point that I've skipped over about sexual neoteny. Um, but yeah, I mean, I've always found it ironic that essentially how much this latest wave of feminism is effectively entrenching itself within the kind of some version of some impossible variant of essentially the kind of the weird sort of that the feminine identity or the female identity itself is going to sort of inherit the power of the kind of the sexual neoteny, and kind of hold it as a standard to be extracted from society and be extracted from the system, because they deserve it as part of recompense and being saved from the system, as the identity is infantilized by this ideological narrative that will have to be dispensed by some kind of political, totalitarian, cultural, sort of tyranny that will have to precipitate some kind of Führer principle, um, so that they can be saved from the system. I mean, that's basically the current state of culture. The idea that your identity should bestow you with a kind of a right to claim self-esteem from anyone who isn't precipitating that self-esteem and delivering it to your identity as is ideologically prescribed, um, via the kind of the canon of whatever dogmatic lever of sort of sadistic control and um, sort of psychological penetration and attaching, uh, you know, to other people's emotional states that you can kind of extract a narcissistic supply uh, to feed your identity. Uh, and all that requires is essentially interpreting every situation in the perspective of the identity and the cause of the identity, and having a kind of reductive identity analysis of everything. And so all you have to do is learn how to ideologically interpret reality, is learn how to filter some kind of a hypothetical identity, sort of plot. And all you have to do is name it. You don't even have to convincingly sort of make a case. You just have to, it just has to sound hypothetically plausible, and then that's good enough as it being true. You don't have to actually prove that that is what was going on, because then you would actually have to mind read the other person, or you'd have to prove essentially that the social construct of identity is the source of social causation. And how do you prove that? You can't. You can merely just assume it and assert it and presume it. So it has this weird sort of tautological begging the question premised in all of its bullshit. That essentially the conclusion of its narrative is used as the premise in constructing that narrative. It's I mean, this kind of dishonesty and pseudo-intellectualism is, well, I mean, this is what fascism has always been a party to. So that you can be huddled under this narrative, and use it to see the world through as a kind of as an external locus of a kind of an objective narrative, so that you can sort of be justified in your blind faith reading of reality, so that your individual eyes don't have to be open to anything, because you've got the constructs essentially to symbolically represent a kind of a drama that you can be embroiled in, essentially acting out through the projection of those factions and categories onto people, the racial imagination, the fascistic worldview, revivified. What's crazy is that this worldview, after being taught to people, after being disseminated, it won't just fade away. It will be resident within people, and it will reemerge at some point. Sadly, I mean, people might start being social justice warriors, but they won't put down this disgusting psychological apparatus, because it's too hypothetically empowering. It's because you can predict anything that you want with it. You can gerrymander reality. Because your conclusion, you can guarantee yourself the conclusion of your accusation using this weird kind of fuzzy nebulous thinking. And so you can essentially force other people to deal with your expectations. The only requisite is, with this ideology and with this formula of ideology, you can force other people to process your expectations and your sense of entitlement, your subjective sense of entitlement, via the vehicle of the identity. But when you do that, the only requisite is that you have to be part of a kind of a thug mafia style ideology. You have to be part of a groupthink that is powerful enough essentially to force people to answer to the dogma, to the orthodoxy. And so the only requisite is essentially is that you are the current cultural hegemon, and essentially as long as you can make it painful enough for people that dispute your hegemony, and you can kind of plague them and hound them and find ways of undermining them and destroying them. um, and essentially it gives its adherents full license to engage in any kind of dishonesty, in any kind of because the ends justify the means according to their formula. Yes, the thing that's left out of that equation is that the ends don't justify the beginnings of the means. The beginnings of the way of thinking is not grounded in anything other than the ends as well. So somehow the ends justify the means, but the ends also somehow create the beginnings as well. So it's a complete. I mean, that's the definition of sort of blind faith, that you're just sort of, well, we're just completely transfixed and mystified by the uh, by the destination, which is not being navigated on the level of the individual, is not being navigated with reference to navigating reality. It's being navigated with reference to navigating the ideological narrative. And the only thing that it requires is that you take the descriptions within the ideological narrative and you essentially project them onto people at will. And then essentially you've got everything related to your vision. Your subjective vision therefore allows you to uh, cherry pick confirmatory aspects of whatever you so wish, and you can kind of sanctimoniously, self-righteously yeah, I mean, the easiest way I think to sort of to summarize these are people who think that because they can create a specious argument that extracts an ought from an that therefore their ought is uh, is sort of symbolically both dominant and divine and worthy of subjugating the world. and I mean, just as a kind of as a meta-analysis, I would say that that is the kind of the formula of the fascistic reduction. Um, but yeah, again, I think we have to also open our eyes also to where the source of this formula originated. I mean, I think we can assume that Hitler's primary caregiver was probably a borderline female, and that his political ideology was somewhat crafted and modeled after essentially working out how to pander to the moral framing of reality, and sort of and to work out a kind of a way to broker an armistice with that formula of processing reality and relating to reality. And he thought that, well, this is the model of something quite powerful. This is the model of something that's capable of being manipulative, um, in a very self uh, aggrandizing, sort of project. Um, and then he kind of built in a kind of nationalistic patriotism or something like that, and grounded it within a kind of a putrid philosophical, um, sort of edifice, but and framework. But yeah, if we don't address the cultural source of these ills, if we don't open our, I mean, it doesn't. We don't even have to, as I say, like what I see as the solution of this is that women just have to be cognizant of this to some degree. They don't, you know, they have to understand this to some degree, to the extent to which that they're, you know, you just have to kind of be aware that this can happen, that this is what can be going on, and so you just have to kind of be vigilant to some extent, and to the extent to which that you're vigilant against it or to monitoring it and to sort of acting appropriately when you see it manifested, um, which I mean essentially most of the advice is. Uh, I mean, I've seen this in terms of narcissism. I'm not sure what the go-to advice is in terms of borderline, but I would say it's probably the same. It's probably no contact. No contact is probably the best sort of strategy of dealing with this. Um, and that means that if you're dealing with someone in a professional situation, uh, essentially no contact in that context simply means, um, limiting contact, uh, to the highest degree possible. Essentially, disconnecting from the from organizing the relation that you have to maintain in a very kind of strict and formal, um, essentially trying to rudimentize whatever level of interaction you are sort of, which becomes unavoidable. Basically managing the unavoidable interaction to the highest degree possible. Um, Within kind of strict regimented, but yeah, I mean, so I mean there's no contact, but there's also, and I mean this is only problematic to the extent to which that this is a minority understanding. When this becomes a kind of uh, a broader and a wider understood phenomena, it'll be easier, because then you won't be prone to the kind of toxic social manipulation which borderlines will often perpetrate on people that don't fall victim to their machinations, essentially. Um, I mean, I've generally said that, these sorts of people, and there are obviously also men who are borderline as well, they just, uh, perhaps uh, within some context, within some professional contexts, they might be fine, but they should certainly not be journalists. They should certainly not be in a situation where they are morally instructing the young, where they, and they should also not be in positions where they have a kind of managerial role over other people. They should in ideally they should be confined from exerting power in a in any kind of ad hoc capacity, in any kind of discretionary of, they should not be in roles that have discretionary powers. But anyway, but yeah, I mean, as long as the that formula of cultural interfacing between men and women is understood essentially as a in as much as that it can be a kind of cultural fetish, that it can be sort of understood uh, dispassionately as something that, perhaps has an imprint within biology in terms of um, that there are natural inclinations that set up essentially the kind of that picture as being a kind of a comfortable homeostasis of sexual relations, but that it needs essentially to be dignified and overcome by a deeper, I mean, this I think is also what was originally being expanded into in terms of the development of Romanticism, in terms of the Russian aristocracy that invented Romanticism, um, and essentially the the project of um, developing a notion of love that was not prone to intrigue and to the kind of degeneracy of a kind of transfixion into some kind of epistemic conduciveness, that in some sense the situation actually had to transcend the picture, uh, the intrigue of how it was potentially construed. You know, I mean, people would not even marry, even if they had real, genuine feelings for one another, if it could have just appeared that the marriage was for convenience. For instance, because it was even understood that that would create a kind of a social um, stigma that would essentially pollute the relationship. It would sort of unsettle and unravel the kind of the cultural importance um, of cultivating a genuine romantic love. Um, I'm obviously, when you remove the this is some of the pretentiousness that perhaps comes along with having to occupy uh, high class society. Uh, if you're operating that same kind of cultural software in uh, in a different sort of time that we live in the modern world, in which there is a massive middle class, much bigger than any aristocracy in Russia, but still the aristocracy in Russia was the largest um, of its kind, which was why they were the only ones that had the sort of the availability to develop romantic love, because all the other aristocracy in Western Europe, for instance, were just far too tiny. They just didn't have enough of a you can't hope to have a marriage based on love and not convenience when there's that much political engineered contrivance into power, and marrying for power and marrying for alliances and um, such. And also the extent to which all the aristocracies in Western Europe were all quite tiny in number. There just wasn't enough to pick from. There wasn't enough to. It was too uh, secluded. Whereas there were 1,000 princes and princesses in Russia. Um, anyway, I just meant to say that never have the conditions been more available to people to develop a reemergence of perhaps even a more deep and authentic romanticism. But sadly, a lot of the heart of romanticism was lost in the Russian Revolution. And then all we were left with was Western Europe, who were always essentially in the shadow of the cradle of Western civilization, which was essentially Russia. And after Russia fell to the revolution, we no longer had essentially um, development of Western civilization. Didn't really, in terms of the cultural sense, never really recovered from the Russian Revolution. I mean, you can understand that uh, King Louis in his apartments he kind of tried to replicate the project, to reimagine the project. Um, or he was trying to compete with Russia at that time, essentially, by trying to concentrate his aristocracy into apartment buildings. And quite uh, ironically, he just kind of created a sort of a sordid replica of perhaps, you know, sort of urban blight and decadence. So he was perhaps ahead of his time, but in not in not such a useful or uplifting way. But anyway, okay, this is probably enough cultural commentary. But yeah, I guess we have to understand how our culture actually operates and start treating it like a game and not like it's a kind of an image to be mesmerized by and to be incepted into, and to sort of and to take unquestioningly, and to sort of and to be imprinted on by some kind of naturalistic fallacy or something like that. But we just have to treat it as individuals with eyes open,